The morning sun cast long shadows across the courthouse steps as Judge Robert Harrison adjusted his black robe and prepared for another day on the bench. At 58 years old, he had been serving Riverside County for over 15 years, and he took pride in running what he considered one of the most efficient courtrooms in the district. His reputation was built on quick decisions and no-nonsense judgments that kept the docket moving smoothly. Harrison had always believed that experience taught him to read people quickly. He could spot trouble from across the room, or at least, that's what he told himself every morning as he reviewed the day's cases. Today seemed no different from any other Tuesday, with the usual lineup of traffic violations, minor disputes, and petty crimes that filled his calendar week after week. The courtroom was buzzing with its typical morning energy. Defense attorneys shuffled through paperwork. Court clerks organized files, and a handful of observers sat in the gallery waiting for their cases to be called. The air conditioning hummed quietly, fighting against the early summer heat that was already building outside. Officer Martinez entered the courtroom with the confidence of someone who had testified hundreds of times before. He was a 10-year veteran of the force, known among his colleagues for his thorough reports and attention to detail. As he took his place at the witness stand, he nodded respectfully toward Judge Harrison, who acknowledged him with a slight nod. In return, the case seemed straightforward enough. A traffic violation that had escalated into something more serious, involving a defendant who had allegedly refused to cooperate during a routine stop. These cases were becoming more common, and Harrison found himself growing increasingly frustrated with what he saw as a general decline in respect for law enforcement. When the defendant was brought into the courtroom, Harrison looked up from his papers to see a well-dressed black woman in her early 30s. She wore a professional navy blue suit and carried herself with obvious education and poise. Her name was listed on the docket as Amara Thompson, and she stood quietly beside her court-appointed attorney, her hands folded in front of her. Officer Martinez began his testimony with the practiced ease of someone who had done this many times before. He described responding to what he initially thought would be a simple traffic stop on Highway 91, just outside the city limits. The defendant had been driving slightly above the speed limit, nothing too serious, but when he activated his lights and pulled her over, things quickly went downhill. "Your Honor," Martinez said, adjusting his uniform slightly. "I approached the vehicle following standard protocol. I identified myself and requested the driver's license and registration. That's when the defendant became combative and uncooperative." Harrison leaned forward slightly, already forming an impression based on the officer's confident delivery. Martinez continued, explaining how the defendant had allegedly refused to provide proper identification and had begun arguing about the legitimacy of the traffic stop. According to his account, she had been belligerent and disrespectful, claiming that she didn't need to follow standard procedures. She kept saying something about federal protocols and acting like normal rules didn't apply to her, Martinez testified. When I asked her to step out of the vehicle for safety reasons, she became even more agitated. She was speaking in what I can only describe as legal jargon, trying to intimidate me and avoid following lawful orders. The officer painted a picture of someone who thought she was above the law, someone who used fancy words and aggressive behavior to try to get out of a simple traffic ticket. He described her as argumentative and confrontational, suggesting that her education and professional appearance were just tools she used to manipulate situations to her advantage. Harrison found himself nodding along with the testimony. He had seen this type of behavior before, or at least he thought he had. People who tried to use their status or education to avoid accountability, who thought they could intimidate officers with big words and aggressive attitudes. It was exactly the kind of disrespect for law enforcement that he believed was becoming too common in society. The defense attorney, a young public defender who looked overwhelmed by his caseload, tried to interject several times during the officer's testimony. He attempted to ask questions about the specific circumstances of the stop, about what protocols the defendant might have been referring to, and about whether there might have been some kind of misunderstanding. But Martinez's answers were consistent and confident, and Harrison found the officer's version of events much more credible than whatever excuse the defense was trying to construct. As the testimony continued, Harrison's impatience grew. He had heard variations of this story countless times before. Someone gets pulled over, they think they're too important to follow standard procedures, they make a scene, and then they come to court expecting sympathy and special treatment. The pattern was all too familiar, and he was already mentally preparing the sentence he would impose. The defendant herself remained quiet throughout most of the officer's testimony, occasionally whispering to her attorney, but never showing the kind of remorse or acknowledgement that Harrison expected to see from someone who had clearly been in the wrong. Her calm demeanor actually irritated him further, as he interpreted it as arrogance and a continued lack of respect for the seriousness of the situation. When Officer Martinez finished his testimony, the defense attorney stood up and requested permission to present his client's side of the story. He explained that there were significant circumstances surrounding the traffic stop that needed to be addressed, and that his client had important information that would clarify the misunderstanding. But Harrison had already heard enough. The officer's testimony was clear, detailed, and believable. The defendant had been given multiple opportunities to cooperate and had chosen instead to be difficult and disrespectful. In his experience, allowing defendants to make lengthy excuses only encouraged more of this type of behavior and slowed down the entire judicial process. The courtroom fell silent as Harrison prepared to render his judgment, unaware that he was about to make a decision that would change everything and expose flaws in the system that he had never imagined existed. Judge Harrison cleared his throat and looked directly at the defendant standing before him. The courtroom was unusually quiet, with even the usual shuffling of papers and whispered conversations coming to a halt. Everyone seemed to sense that something significant was about to happen, though no one could have predicted just how wrong things were about to go. Amara Thompson stood with her shoulders straight, maintaining the same composed posture she had held throughout Officer Martinez's testimony. Her attorney, a nervous young public defender named David Chen, was frantically shuffling through his notes, clearly preparing to present what he believed would be crucial information for his client's defense. "Your Honor," Chen began, his voice slightly shaky with the eagerness of someone who knew he had important facts to share. "If I may present my client's credentials and explain the circumstances that led to this misunderstanding." But Harrison raised his hand, cutting him off mid-sentence. The judge had already made up his mind based on what he considered to be clear and convincing testimony from a veteran police officer. In his 15 years on the bench, he had developed what he believed was an excellent ability to separate legitimate defenses from elaborate excuses, and this case seemed straightforward to him. "Counselor," Harrison said firmly, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question, "I've heard quite enough testimony to understand what happened here. Officer Martinez has provided a detailed and credible account of the events, and frankly, I find his version far more believable than whatever story your client might want to tell." The defendant's attorney looked stunned. He glanced at his client, who remained remarkably calm despite the judge's dismissive tone. Chen tried again, his voice gaining strength as he realized the gravity of the situation. "Your Honor, with all due respect, there are federal protocols involved here that explain my client's behavior during the traffic stop. She was following proper procedures for—" "Federal protocols?" Harrison interrupted, his eyebrows raising with obvious skepticism. "Mr. Chen, that sounds exactly like the kind of elaborate excuse I hear in this courtroom every single day. Everyone thinks they have special circumstances. Everyone believes they deserve special treatment. But the law applies to everyone equally, regardless of their education level or their ability to use fancy legal terminology." The judge's voice grew more stern as he continued. He had seen this before, or at least he believed he had. People who thought they could intimidate their way out of consequences by throwing around impressive-sounding phrases and claiming special knowledge of procedures that didn't actually exist. It was exactly the type of behavior that undermined respect for the entire justice system. Amara Thompson finally spoke up, her voice clear and professional despite the increasingly hostile atmosphere in the courtroom. "Your Honor, if I could just explain my position and show you my identification, I believe this entire situation can be cleared up very quickly." Harrison looked at her with growing irritation. Her calm, confident manner only reinforced his belief that she was someone who was used to getting her way through intimidation and manipulation, the way she spoke, the way she carried herself. Even the expensive cut of her business suit all seemed to confirm Officer Martinez's description of someone who thought she was above the law. "Ma'am," Harrison said, his tone becoming increasingly sharp, "I don't need to see any special identification or hear any elaborate explanations. What I need to see is some acknowledgement that your behavior was inappropriate and disrespectful to a law enforcement officer who was simply trying to do his job." The courtroom atmosphere grew more tense as spectators began to realize they were witnessing something unusual. Court reporters typed frantically, capturing every word of an exchange that was rapidly spiraling out of control. Even the bailiffs seemed to sense that something was off, though they couldn't put their finger on exactly what was wrong. Chen made one more desperate attempt to present his client's case. "Your Honor, I'm begging you to allow me to present evidence that will completely change your understanding of this situation. My client is—" "Your client," Harrison interrupted forcefully, banging his gavel for emphasis, "is someone who chose to disrespect a police officer, refuse lawful orders, and then come into my courtroom expecting special treatment. This is exactly the kind of behavior that undermines our entire justice system." The judge paused, looking directly at Thompson with a mixture of disappointment and anger. He genuinely believed he was about to deliver a lesson that would benefit not only the defendant, but everyone else in the courtroom who might be tempted to follow her example. "Ma'am, your behavior as described by Officer Martinez represents everything that's wrong with people's attitudes toward law enforcement today. You acted like you were above the law, like normal rules didn't apply to you, and like you could intimidate your way out of consequences through aggressive behavior and fancy talk." Harrison's voice grew louder as he warmed to his theme. "I've been on this bench for 15 years, and I've seen enough cases to recognize when someone thinks they're too important to follow the same rules as everyone else. Your education, your professional appearance, your ability to speak in legal terminology, none of that gives you the right to disrespect police officers or ignore lawful commands." The defendant's attorney looked increasingly desperate, making frantic gestures and trying to get the judge's attention. But Harrison was focused entirely on what he saw as a teachable moment for everyone in the courtroom. "Therefore," Harrison announced, his voice carrying the full weight of judicial authority, "I'm sentencing you to 30 days in county jail, a fine of $2,500, and 100 hours of community service. Maybe spending some time behind bars will help you develop a better appreciation for the law enforcement officers who risk their lives to keep our community safe." The gavel came down with a sharp crack that seemed to echo through the suddenly silent courtroom. Thompson's attorney stood frozen in shock, his mouth open as if he couldn't believe what had just happened. The defendant herself remained remarkably composed, though those watching closely might have noticed a slight tightening around her eyes. "Bailiff," Harrison called out, already moving on to what he considered the next item of business, "please take the defendant into custody. We need to move on to the next case." As the handcuffs clicked around Thompson's wrists, no one in the courtroom could have imagined that they had just witnessed one of the most spectacular judicial errors in the county's history, one that would soon expose a web of corruption and force everyone involved to confront uncomfortable truths about justice, prejudice, and the power of assumptions. Judge Harrison returned to his chambers feeling satisfied with how he had handled the morning's cases. He loosened his tie and settled into his leather chair, already mentally preparing for the afternoon session. Outside his window, the California sun was beating down on the courthouse parking lot, and he could see lawyers and clerks hurrying between buildings, their arms full of case files and legal documents. The judge had always prided himself on being decisive. In his mind, that was what separated good judges from weak ones. Too many of his colleagues got bogged down in endless arguments and elaborate defenses that only served to slow down the system and confuse clear-cut issues. He believed that most cases, especially traffic violations that escalated into bigger problems, were pretty straightforward when you cut through all the noise and excuses. His secretary knocked gently on his door around 2 in the afternoon. "Judge Harrison, you have an urgent call from the district attorney's office. They said it's extremely important." Harrison glanced at his watch and sighed. Urgent calls from the DA's office usually meant politics or some kind of administrative headache that would eat up time he needed for case preparation. But he picked up the phone anyway, expecting to hear about budget issues or scheduling conflicts. Judge Harrison speaking. The voice on the other end belonged to Patricia Williams, the chief prosecutor for the county. Her tone was strained in a way that immediately caught his attention. Patricia was known for being calm under pressure, so hearing her sound genuinely worried made Harrison sit up straighter in his chair. Robert, we have a serious problem. A very serious problem. The woman you sentenced this morning, Amara Thompson, she's not just any defendant. She's Assistant Federal Prosecutor Amara Thompson from the United States Attorney's Office. The words hit Harrison like a physical blow. He felt his stomach drop as the full meaning of what Patricia was saying began to sink in. That's impossible, he said, though even as the words left his mouth, he knew Patricia wouldn't call with false information about something this serious. I wish it were impossible, Patricia continued, her voice heavy with the implications. But it gets worse, Robert. Much worse. She wasn't just some federal prosecutor who happened to get pulled over. She was working undercover on a major corruption investigation involving several officers in our local law enforcement agencies. Harrison's hand began to shake slightly as he held the phone. The confident satisfaction he had felt just hours earlier was rapidly transforming into a cold dread that seemed to settle in his chest like a heavy weight. Patricia continued with details that made each revelation more devastating than the last. The investigation has been going on for over 8 months. They've been looking into allegations of evidence planting, bribery, and racially motivated targeting by certain officers in our department. Officer Martinez, the one who testified in your courtroom this morning, he's one of the primary suspects in the federal investigation. The judge felt the room beginning to spin slightly. He gripped the edge of his desk as Patricia's words continued to wash over him like waves of increasingly bad news. Robert, are you still there? The traffic stop wasn't random. Martinez recognized Thompson from a previous courthouse encounter when she was there on official federal business. He deliberately targeted her because he suspected she might be investigating his unit. Her so-called uncooperative behavior was actually her following proper federal protocols for maintaining her undercover status. Harrison's mind raced back to the morning's testimony. He remembered how confident Martinez had seemed, how detailed. His story was how he had painted Thompson as arrogant and disrespectful. Now he was beginning to understand that every word of that testimony might have been carefully crafted lies designed to destroy the credibility of a federal prosecutor who was getting too close to the truth. The protocols she mentioned, Patricia continued. They're real federal guidelines for undercover operations. When she tried to show identification, she was attempting to reveal her federal credentials to resolve the situation quietly. When your attorney tried to explain her position, he was trying to tell you that she's been working a major federal case. The full scope of his mistake was becoming clearer with every sentence. Harrison realized that his quick judgment and dismissive attitude had not only wronged an innocent person, but had potentially damaged a federal investigation that had been months in the making. Patricia, he said, his voice barely above a whisper, how bad is this going to get? There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When Patricia finally spoke, her tone was grave. The media is already starting to pick up the story. Civil rights organizations are calling for investigations into judicial bias. The FBI is reviewing whether federal obstruction charges might be appropriate. And worst of all, defense attorneys for all the officers under investigation are now claiming that the entire federal case is compromised because of what happened in your courtroom. Harrison felt sick to his stomach. He realized that his hasty decision hadn't just hurt one person, it had potentially allowed corrupt police officers to escape justice, and had handed them a powerful weapon to use against the federal investigation. The officer's testimony this morning, Patricia continued, it's already being used by defense lawyers as evidence that Thompson is untrustworthy and that the federal investigation is somehow illegitimate. They're arguing that if a judge found her behavior so problematic that he sentenced her to jail time, then how can her testimony and evidence be trusted in their corruption cases? The irony was devastating. Harrison's attempt to teach someone a lesson about respecting law enforcement had actually protected corrupt officers and undermined the very system of justice he thought he was defending. His phone buzzed with another call. His secretary's voice came through the intercom. "Judge Harrison, I have reporters calling about the Thompson case. Channel 7 News wants a statement, and the Times is asking about your sentencing decision." Harrison closed his eyes and took a deep breath. He knew that within hours his name would be connected to one of the biggest judicial errors in the county's recent history. More importantly, he was beginning to understand that his quick assumptions and unwillingness to listen had revealed uncomfortable truths about his own biases and decision-making process. The afternoon sun was still shining through his window, but everything else in Judge Harrison's world had fundamentally changed. He was about to learn that sometimes the consequences of our mistakes extend far beyond what we could ever imagine, and that the pursuit of justice requires much more than quick decisions and firm authority. By the next morning, Judge Harrison's phone hadn't stopped ringing. He sat in his home office, still wearing yesterday's wrinkled shirt, staring at the growing pile of newspapers spread across his desk. The headlines were getting worse by the hour, and each new story revealed more details about the federal investigation he had unknowingly sabotaged. The first call came from his longtime colleague, Judge Rebecca Foster, who had worked in the neighboring courthouse for over 20 years. Her voice was filled with the kind of concern that comes from genuine friendship mixed with professional worry. "Robert, I've been getting calls all morning from reporters asking about your reputation, your track record, your decision-making process. The story is spreading beyond our county. The State Judicial Review Board is already asking questions." Harrison rubbed his temples, feeling a headache that had been building since yesterday afternoon. "Rebecca, I had no idea. The officer's testimony seemed so credible, so detailed. How was I supposed to know he was lying about everything?" "That's exactly the problem everyone's talking about," Rebecca replied gently. "People are asking why. You didn't let the defense attorney speak? Why you didn't look at her identification? Why you rushed to judgment so quickly? Robert, I've known you for 15 years, and this doesn't sound like the careful judge I know." As the morning progressed, Harrison began learning the full scope of the federal investigation that his decision had compromised. The case files that started arriving from various sources painted a picture of corruption that went much deeper than he had initially understood. Prosecutor Thompson had been working on what federal investigators called Operation Clean Sweep, a comprehensive investigation into a network of officers who had been systematically targeting minority citizens for years. The evidence included planted drugs, falsified reports, stolen money, and a pattern of racial profiling that had destroyed dozens of innocent lives. Officer Martinez wasn't just a corrupt cop, he was allegedly the ringleader of the entire operation. The federal investigation had gathered evidence showing how he had recruited other officers, taught them how to falsify reports, and even provided them with drugs to plant during traffic stops. Thompson had been building a case that would have put Martinez and at least 11 other officers behind bars for decades. The traffic stop that led to Thompson's arrest had been Martinez's desperate attempt to blow her cover and destroy the investigation. He had recognized her from a previous courthouse encounter, where she had been present for a federal hearing. When he saw her driving alone on Highway 91, he saw an opportunity to discredit her and potentially end the entire federal case. Harrison's phone rang again. This time it was the chief federal prosecutor for the district, a man named William Rodriguez, who spoke with the authority of someone accustomed to handling major criminal cases. "Judge Harrison, I need you to understand what your decision has done to our investigation. We had Martinez dead to rights. 8 months of undercover work, hundreds of hours of recorded conversations, financial records showing bribes, physical evidence of planted drugs. We were 3 weeks away from making arrests." Rodriguez's voice was calm but firm, like a doctor delivering a serious diagnosis. "Now, defense attorneys are using your sentencing decision as evidence that our lead prosecutor is unreliable. They're claiming that if a judge found her behavior so problematic that he sentenced her to jail, then obviously she can't be trusted to tell the truth about police corruption." The implications were staggering. Harrison realized that his 30-second decision had potentially allowed dangerous criminals to escape justice and continue victimizing innocent people. The evidence was still there. but Thompson's credibility as the lead prosecutor had been severely damaged by his public condemnation of her character. As the day continued, Harrison began receiving calls from people whose lives had been destroyed by the corrupt officers he had inadvertently protected. A mother named Lisa Chen called to tell him about her son, a college student who had been arrested by Martinez on fabricated drug charges. The young man had spent 6 months in jail before the charges were quietly dropped, but not before he lost his scholarship and dropped out of school. "Judge Harrison," Lisa said, her voice breaking with emotion, "my son was going to be a doctor. He had a full scholarship to medical school. Officer Martinez planted drugs in his car during a traffic stop and my son's life was destroyed. The federal investigation was our only hope for justice, and now I'm hearing that it might fall apart because of what happened in your courtroom." Another call came from Robert Jackson, a mechanic who had been targeted by the same group of officers multiple times. They had falsely arrested him, stolen money from his shop during searches, and harassed his family for months. The federal investigation had given him hope that the officers would finally face consequences for their actions. "I don't understand how this happened," Jackson said. "The federal prosecutor was trying to help people like me, and you treated her like she was a criminal. These officers have been destroying lives for years, and now they might get away with it because you wouldn't listen to the truth." Harrison found himself unable to eat or sleep as more details emerged. He learned that Martinez had a history of racial profiling complaints that had been ignored by department supervisors. He discovered that the officer had been under federal surveillance for months, with agents documenting his illegal activities in detail. The most devastating revelation came when Harrison read Thompson's actual federal credentials and case file. She wasn't just any prosecutor. She was a decorated former FBI agent who had specialized in police corruption cases for over a decade. Her track record included successful prosecutions of corrupt officers in 3 different states, and she had received multiple commendations for her work protecting civil rights. Media coverage intensified throughout the week. National news outlets picked up the story, framing it as a perfect example of how racial bias could corrupt the justice system. Legal experts appeared on television discussing the case, with many pointing to Harrison's refusal to examine Thompson's credentials as evidence of unconscious prejudice. The most painful moment came when Harrison finally watched the courthouse security footage of Thompson's arrest. He could see the dignity with which she carried herself even as she was led away in handcuffs, and he noticed details he had missed during the hearing. Her calm attempts to explain the situation, her attorney's desperate gestures, the quiet professionalism she maintained even in the face of his harsh judgment. Harrison realized that everything he thought he knew about reading people and making quick decisions had been fundamentally wrong. His confidence in his ability to spot trouble and deliver swift justice had blinded him to the truth and caused immeasurable harm to both an innocent person and the cause of justice itself. 3 weeks after the courthouse incident that changed everything, Judge Harrison stood in his empty chambers, packing the last of his personal belongings into cardboard boxes. The weight of what had happened hadn't lessened with time. Instead, it had grown heavier as he learned more about the lives that had been affected by his split-second decision. The disciplinary hearing had been scheduled for the following month, but Harrison knew he couldn't wait that long to take action. Every day that passed meant more opportunities for the corrupt officers to destroy evidence, intimidate witnesses, or harm other innocent people. The investigation that Prosecutor Thompson had worked so hard to build was hanging by a thread, and he felt responsible for every moment of delay. His decision to publicly apologize had shocked everyone, including his own family. His wife had tried to talk him out of it, worried about the impact on his reputation and their financial security. His colleagues had warned him that admitting fault would only make the legal consequences worse. But Harrison had spent sleepless nights thinking about Lisa Chen's son, about Robert Jackson's destroyed business, about all the victims whose only hope for justice had been damaged by his prejudice. The press conference had been scheduled for 10 in the morning on a Tuesday, exactly 1 month after Thompson's wrongful sentencing. Harrison had written his statement by hand, wanting every word to come from his heart rather than from some lawyer's carefully crafted language designed to minimize liability. Standing at the podium outside the courthouse, Facing a crowd of reporters, civil rights activists, and community members, Harrison felt more nervous than he had ever felt in his 15 years as a judge. But he also felt something else, a sense of purpose that came from finally doing the right thing, even though it was far too late. I am here today to publicly apologize to Assistant Federal Prosecutor Amara Thompson for the grave injustice I committed in my courtroom, he began, his voice steady, despite the cameras and microphones pointed in his direction. I allowed my unconscious biases and my rush to judgment to override my duty to ensure fair treatment for all people who appear before me. The crowd was unusually quiet as Harrison continued. He didn't try to make excuses or shift blame to Officer Martinez's false testimony. Instead, he focused on his own failures, the assumptions he had made based on race, his refusal to listen to the defense attorney, his dismissive attitude toward Thompson's attempts to explain her situation. I realize now that I saw a black woman trying to assert her rights and her professional credentials, and I interpreted that strength and confidence as arrogance and disrespect. I failed to recognize that my own biases were preventing me from seeing the truth that was right in front of me. The apology was just the beginning. Harrison announced that he was immediately enrolling in comprehensive bias training programs, not just the basic courses required by the state, but intensive workshops that would help him understand how prejudice had shaped his decision-making throughout his career. He also called for a complete review of every case that had involved Officer Martinez over the past 5 years. If Martinez was willing to lie under oath in my courtroom to protect his criminal activities, then we must assume he has lied in other cases as well. Every person he arrested, every testimony he gave, every report he filed must be examined for potential misconduct. The impact of Harrison's public acknowledgement was immediate and far-reaching. Defense attorneys across the county began filing appeals for clients who had been convicted based on Martinez's testimony. The district attorney's office announced that they would not oppose these appeals, effectively admitting that dozens of cases might have been based on fabricated evidence. More importantly, Harrison's confession seemed to give other victims the courage to come forward. Within days of his press conference, 17 more people contacted federal investigators with stories of harassment, false arrests, and planted evidence involving Martinez and his network of corrupt officers. Prosecutor Thompson, who had been quietly working to rebuild her damaged case, found that Harrison's public apology had restored much of her credibility. Defense attorneys could no longer claim that her character was questionable when the judge who had initially condemned her was now admitting that his judgment had been wrong and biased. The federal investigation, which had seemed doomed just weeks earlier, suddenly gained new momentum. The combination of Harrison's admission, the new witnesses coming forward, and the physical evidence that had been gathered during months of surveillance created an overwhelming case against the corrupt officers. 6 months later, Martinez and 11 other officers were arrested in coordinated raids across the county. The evidence against them included recorded conversations, financial records showing bribes, and physical evidence of drugs that had been planted during false arrests. Martinez himself was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison, while his co-conspirators received sentences ranging from 5 to 12 years. For Harrison, the consequences were both professional and personal. He faced formal disciplinary action from the State Judicial Review Board, which resulted in a public censure and mandatory training. His reputation was permanently damaged, and he knew he would always be remembered more for his mistake than for his years of service. But something unexpected happened as Harrison worked through the bias training programs and began examining his own decision-making patterns. He discovered that his error with Thompson wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a broader pattern of unconscious prejudice that had affected many of his rulings over the years. Working with civil rights organizations, Harrison began developing new procedures for his courtroom that would prevent similar incidents. He implemented mandatory cooling-off periods before sentencing, required review of all defendant credentials regardless of the charges, and established protocols for ensuring that defense attorneys could present crucial information before judgments were made. The most meaningful moment came when Harrison finally met with Prosecutor Thompson face-to-face, 6 months after the incident. She had agreed to meet with him not because she had forgiven him, but because she wanted to understand how such a failure of justice had occurred. "Judge Harrison," she said during their private meeting, "what happened to me was painful and professionally damaging. But I want you to know that your willingness to admit your mistake and work for change has helped restore my faith that the system can improve, even when it fails dramatically." Thompson's federal corruption case became a landmark example of how justice could prevail even when the system seemed stacked against it. Her work led to comprehensive reforms in police oversight and judicial training programs that were adopted across multiple states. For Harrison, the incident became a defining moment that transformed him from a judge who prided himself on quick decisions into one who understood that true justice requires patience, humility, and constant examination of our own biases and assumptions.